Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today we'll be talking to Morgan Davis and Tyler Groh about saturated riparian buffers. What is a saturated riparian buffer? How do they impact air and water quality? How can we best strike a balance with both? Answers to all these and more coming right up. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show today. Today we have Dr. Morgan Davis and Dr. Tyler Groh with us. Dr. Davis is a soil biogeochemist whose research focuses on ecological sustainability. He's currently a postdoctoral fellow in the agronomy department at Iowa State University. He received his PhD in environmental science from Iowa State University and his bachelor's and master's in natural resources and environmental science from the University of Illinois. Dr. Groh was born and raised in Jackson, Wisconsin. He majored in watershed management at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, then got his master's at the University of Illinois in natural resources and environmental science while studying nutrient removal and greenhouse gas emissions from constructed wetlands treating tile drainage water. He went to Iowa State University for his PhD in environmental science, studying nitrate removal in both saturated and traditional riparian buffers, and is now a postdoctoral researcher at Iowa State looking at new designs of saturated buffers in order to increase the amount of tile water they can treat and therefore the potential amount of nitrogen they can remove. Welcome to the show. How are you guys doing today?
Doing really well.
Yeah, great.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining us today. So we are going to be talking about riparian buffers today, specifically saturated ones. So can you just give us a little bit of background on what a riparian buffer is, what it does, and what it looks like?
Yes. Riparian zones are basically any zone next to streams, rivers, creeks, whatever you want to call them, even ditches. And traditionally, buffers are perennial vegetation that you plant and take row crop agriculture out of that land and plant these perennial systems to have some sort of coverage throughout the year. They help reduce stream bank erosion as well as trap overland sediment as it moves from uplands to the creek. Before it enters the creek, it'll help remove that. And it's also, riparian zones are an area where it's kind of like a biogeochemistry hotspot. A lot of nutrient cycling goes on there. It's where water chemistry meets soil chemistry, and you have a lot of different interactions that can therefore remove nutrients before they enter streams.
And what's the difference between a traditional buffer and a saturated buffer?
Yes, great question. So the Midwest region has a lot of tile drains that help drain uplands to therefore grow row crops, mostly corn and soybean in the Corn Belt region here. And these drains usually allow the tile drainage water to bypass the buffer. And that usually happens in more traditional buffers. The hydrology becomes disconnected and all the water flows out of these pipes into the streams. And therefore we get little to no nutrient removal through that system. What a saturated buffer does is we place a control box on that tile and we run another tile parallel to the stream or field edge. And we allow part of that water to be diverted to the buffer, once again connecting the hydrology of the tile drainage water back to the buffer system. And as the water slowly seeps through the system, we get nitrate removal through three different methods. One is plant uptake, another is microbial immobilization, and then the final one, the one that we found to be that removes the most amount of nitrate, is denitrification, which is a microbial process.
Sure, and we'll be talking more about that in a little bit here. But you also mentioned another term that I just wanted to go over real quick. So these tile drainage systems, how do those actually work and function? What do those look like?
Yeah, perfect question. The tile drainage systems in the Midwest are installed usually about 3 feet deep on average, and they're nowadays pattern drains. So the drains they're basically plastic tile that have holes in it that allow gravity to drain the soils, to remove all the excess moisture from these soils that maybe had once been a wetland, but it's now a crop field. And the tiles are put in a space every 10 or so feet from each other, and they all enter a bigger main drain that then goes to the creek and gets the water off of the surface of the crop fields and allow farmers to, one, get into their fields at an earlier time in the springtime and make the really rich mollisol soils in the Midwest farmable and produce the corn and soybean crops that we are all familiar with.
Yeah, you can kind of think of them as even like a drainage system that goes through any city. But instead of big concrete structures, it is just plastic tubing that's placed under the soil. So these range anywhere from 4 inches to 24 inches. So you can get a really big pipe under the soil or a really small one. And so in a majority of the Corn Belt that has poorly drained soils, we have millions of miles of pipe that are kind of under all farm fields when you kind of drive across the Corn Belt from, Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa.
That's amazing. This is a relatively new discovery for me, definitely since I started working here. And you would never guess. So how does that work for them to install these? I mean, they just tear up a field for a while. I mean, what time of year even are they doing this that it's not interrupting their actual farm work, or do they just take a hit to do it piece by piece? I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, perfect question. So tile contractors are usually busy in the early spring and late fall when the crops are not in, and their trenchers can tile a field in a day or less, depending how big the field is. So they can install a pretty big tile system in a very little time nowadays with the bigger machines that they have.
Yeah, the reason why it's called tile is because these tubes or pipes were originally terracotta tubes, so kind of like the terracotta pot that you might use on your back porch, but they were in the shape of these tubes. And so early settlers would actually have to dig a ditch by hand and lay these tubes really close to one another to create the void and kind of a continuous pipe for the water to be drained from. And nowadays, as Tyler mentioned, they have these big trenchers that have a big knife that kind of pushes through the soil and separates it, puts the pipe in the ground at the depth that you want. And then it also has an apparatus that closes the soil back over that pipe. So like Tyler said, it can be done in, a day, where, this used to take a really long time and only the poorest drained soils were really tiled. But now when you do install new tile, it can be done on a more organized basis.
That is remarkable. I was unprepared for these fun facts heading into this interview, and I'm just super jazzed. I want to go see one of these trenchers at work.
There's some great videos on YouTube. If you just search tile drainage install, you can see these huge pieces of equipment just moving, making this big trench, putting in the pipe and covering it back up. It's pretty impressive.
That is super impressive. I will definitely look that up and see if we can get some of those for the show notes for sure. But I wanted to loop back to something that Tyler mentioned earlier, which is denitrification. So can you just give a quick overview of how that process works?
Yes. So there's a good analogy for denitrification, and we as humans, we have to consume food and breathe oxygen in order to survive. Microbes, a specific kind of microbes, can basically do the same thing. They eat soil carbon, and specifically more nutritious, more labile carbon that they like, and then they can use nitrate to breathe under anaerobic conditions. So anaerobic conditions meaning sans oxygen, no oxygen available, so then they go to nitrate, and they breathe nitrate. And when they do that, they respire ultimately into gas, which is a non-reactive nitrogen that makes up 78% of the atmosphere. And that's what we hope for in that process, is that most, if not all of it, goes to N2 gas. But some of the gas also ends up being emitted as nitrous oxide, which is N2O, a strong greenhouse gas that influences global climate change.
So one of the reasons you would maybe pick a saturated buffer over a traditional buffer is to avoid some of those nutrients kind of leaching past your buffer to get into a stream source. But one of the concerns with them that you wanted to study with this was if using a saturated buffer would increase this denitrification in the incomplete or negative sense of what it can release. Can you explain how a saturated buffer could potentially increase the nitrous oxide emissions?
Yeah, so the idea is, all of this underground piping it's moving out. A big thing that it moves is nitrate. This is usually a big topic in the popular press, whether it's nutrients, a big one being nitrate, making it to the Gulf of Mexico and causing large algae blooms down there, or if it's local water quality of having excess nitrate in drinking water supplies and that needing to be removed. So the tile is acting like a highway for those nutrients to make it to the water. And so our tool that we can use on the landscape to remove some of that nitrogen back to nitrogen gas is this denitrification. As Tyler mentioned, if the denitrification is kind of incomplete, we can get this nitrous oxide emission. So the last thing that we kind of want to do is, encourage this denitrification to happen, but also be increasing the nitrous oxide emissions. But this gets very complicated because it's not like once the nitrate leaves the pipe that it stays as nitrate forever. It can hit the stream and then also turn to nitrous oxide emissions. So we kind of wanted to ask a specific question of, if you have three management plans on the landscape, a traditional buffer, which has your pipe running straight through the ground to the stream, or a saturated buffer where you're diverting some of that water back into the soil so it can interact with those microbes and denitrification can happen. And then also, what if you had a crop field right up to the edge of the stream? And we wanted to see what were the differences in nitrous oxide emissions between those three.
Yeah, that transitions us really well into our next section here, which is, of course, how you actually completed this research. So can you just tell me a little bit more about the experimental design, maybe what you were testing against to see if one was worse than the other? Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so we looked at the three different treatments on the landscape of a crop field, a saturated buffer, and a traditional buffer. And so nitrous oxide can leave the landscape in a couple different ways. One is through the surface of the soil. So to measure that, we used chambers, tops that are placed over the top of the soil to measure the flux of gas that is leaving the soil. And so we would go out weekly and make these measurements to get kind of a yearly loss of how much nitrous oxide was leaving the soil from our three systems. So we did that for all of them. We also measured the amount of nitrous oxide that was dissolved in the water because there are a lot of gases in water. Some are easily dissolved and others are harder, but when you have denitrification going on in the soil, the nitrous oxide can be dissolved in the water. So it's an important piece to measure. For our crop field and our traditional buffer, our tile is routed straight to our stream. So we measured the amount of nitrous oxide that was dissolved in that tile water leaving the stream. In our saturated buffer was a little different. We measured the dissolved that didn't get filtered into our saturated buffer. So unfortunately, we can't capture all of the water that leaves that field, but only a portion to send it into our buffer. So we measured how much was leaving, again, directly to the stream. And then we measured the amount of dissolved that was leaving our saturated buffer. And we utilized groundwater wells to do this. So we would sample the wells, again, on a weekly basis to measure that dissolved fraction. So at the end of the day, we were able to total the surface emissions as well as those dissolved gas emissions to compare our three systems.
I have a few questions off of that. So working backwards a little bit, I guess. For the groundwater wells, are you just using wells that already exist on people's land, or are you like just drilling a specific hole for this project?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we put in specific wells for this project. We were lucky enough to work with two real farmers here in Iowa who were really involved in conservation practices, and so they gave us permission to go out on the field and drill a hole and put our well in, and we had these spread across the edge of the buffer, so we knew we were capturing maybe the different types of water that are moving through the buffer, because these soils are not perfectly homogeneous. They are influenced by the river, and so some spots can be a little sandier than others. Some may have a little more clay or silt. So we wanted to make sure we were kind of capturing the range of losses that could be leaving from that. So we had a transect of wells on the edge of the buffer to measure what was leaving the buffer into the stream.
Yeah, thank you to those farmers for volunteering their land. That's wonderful. So then, sub question that was sparked off of that one. So this nitrate that you're draining, is there not a way to like put a filter on the pipe that could collect it for reuse? Or obviously I do not have the science background to know if that is an absurd idea, but I mean, is there ways that you can reuse it, or that they can catch it before it just gets dumped into the stream? Or maybe this is a relatively new thing that people are working on, and so they're still exploring, but any thoughts on that?
That's an excellent question. There's a couple different systems out there. So there's people looking into drainage water recycling, which is basically capturing a bunch of the tile drainage water in some sort of pond or sump that then they can then pump back into the field when they need it under dry conditions and sub-irrigate the crops with it. So that's kind of like a reuse type thing with that nitrate. Another way of capturing the nitrate at least inside the field, is with cover crops. So cover crops are any crop that you grow in between your main cash crop. And it kind of helps keep the soil in place, as well as takes up any nutrients that may be in the soil at that time, converts it into their organic tissues. And then when that crop is killed and integrated into the soil, the organic matter can break down into those nutrients again for your cash crop to take up again. So those are the two main methods I can think of off the top of my head to kind of capture it and reuse it, or just keep in the field without having it go into the tile.
Yeah, the hardest thing with a lot of this is, say, installing a filter, because nitrate can be removed from water using different methods, and water treatment plants use these. The problem is, number one, there's a lot of water that is draining these landscapes. If you take, say, an inch of water over a square mile of field and assume that all gets drained kind of into one location, you can kind of visualize how much water that actually is. And so when we get a 3 or 4 inch rain event, there's a lot of water moving really fast off the landscape. And so that's one of the biggest challenges with any treatment or design to try and reduce the amount of nitrate losses from the system. And even if we were to put a big filter on there and catch the nitrate, that nitrate would still have to go somewhere in the environment. And so the great thing about working with systems that use denitrification is the majority of that nitrate is now being converted back to the N2 gas. And our atmosphere is nearly 80% nitrogen gas. So it's really taking a reactive nutrient that is vital for crop growth, but can cause environmental problems, and converting it back to nitrogen gas. It can be seen as kind of a permanent removal rather than a temporary removal.
Yeah, I think what's really just so interesting with anything nutrient management is it's just kind of this like weird herding cats kind of situation of just trying to get it where you want it to go, but then all of a sudden there's too much, or just there's so many factors in it. I just think it's really fascinating work. So thank you both for entering these fields of research. But I promised I would go up a few layers in my questions. So the last of those initial questions that was sparked by your wonderful response is, referring to these chambers, so I actually talked to a different guest about this fairly recently, Olenka Ford, if anyone wants to look up her episode. It's wonderful. And she was actually trying to like measure gases where she wasn't sure where they were going to pop up from like these leaking wells. So how did you guys handle that of where you place them or how long you try to measure at any given time to know that you're getting kind of a representative sample? As you said, Morgan, it's not all a homogeneous environment. Is there any research that shows that maybe more gas is released, closer to where those controls are in place, or is it pretty even across the field? Anything like that?
Yeah, so we designed our chamber placement in transects to kind of see if there was more coming out, say, close to that box where all of the water is coming into the distribution pipe. And so we had transects going out on our buffer from the main distribution box, but also as it moves from the distribution tile to the stream. So we tried to have a grid of rings in place. And so these buffers on average were probably 300 feet by 20 to 30 feet. So we tried to have, again, a grid pattern to represent different soil types. And I think the vote's still out on whether or not we had more denitrification closer to the box. A different type of study probably needs to be done because we were really trying to quantify what was leaving for a yearly basis. So I think a more intensive design would be appropriate to really answer that question. We do know that through, at least on agricultural fields, that if you sample once a week for the entirety of the year, that you can capture about 90% of the variability that is associated with greenhouse gas emissions from the soil surface. So a great researcher at the USDA here in Ames, the National Lab for Ag and the Environment, Dr. Tim Parkin, has done a lot of great work to kind of look at some of this variability. So we tried to take that into account, but gas data is inherently noisy data. And it's, especially when it comes to nitrous oxide emissions, there's not always a great pattern with, say, soil moisture or temperature. So as Tyler mentioned at the beginning of our discussion here, that these need to be anaerobic systems. So you would think that the more nitrous oxide you would have coming off of the soil, the more moisture would also be in the soil. But that doesn't always quite line up because it's hard to get those microbes motivated in the wintertime when temperatures are really cold. So there's a lot of variables that can kind of come together. So our method for really trying to account for that variability was to have as many rings or chamber tops out on the system as possible, and then sampling them once a week. And we also developed an automated sampler so we could collect at a little bit higher density than is typical for gas studies. So those collected the samples for us, so we didn't have to be at every location every 15 minutes. So we could sample a lot more with a lot fewer people.
Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Morgan and Tyler's article, Nitrous Oxide Emissions from Saturated Riparian Buffers, Are We Trading a Water Quality Problem for an Air Quality Problem?, published in the Journal of Environmental Quality, will be freely available for the next 2 weeks. You can find a link to it in our show notes. Let's get back to the show. That's wonderful. I feel you, microbes. It is very hard to be motivated in the winter when it is cold. Yeah. So I get it.
Yeah.
So let's move on then and talk about your results. You were taking all of this data from your wells and your chambers. What did you find?
Yeah, we found that if we combined all this data together and look at nitrous oxide emissions as a whole from each of our systems, so including both the surface emissions as well as the dissolved, that statistically, there was no difference between our saturated riparian buffer and our traditional riparian buffer for total emissions. So, our article and the title has, Are We Trading a Water Quality Problem for an Air Quality Problem?, being the big question we wanted to ask. And if we decided that if you have a traditional buffer in place and then you redesign it as a saturated buffer, you should not see a significant increase in nitrous oxide emissions from this implementation. Furthermore, we found that if you are currently farming that riparian area right next to the stream, and a lot of years can be flooded out or might have some of the stream bank erosion that Tyler was talking about, and convert it into a saturated buffer, you can actually reduce the amount of nitrous oxide emissions leaving from that area. And this is mainly due to you're no longer fertilizing that area. Fertilizer is a big driver of nitrous oxide emissions. So in a crop field, after you fertilize, you often see big spikes in nitrous oxide emissions. And so if you eliminate those big spikes from the system and change it to a perennial saturated buffer, you can actually reduce the amount of nitrous oxide emissions coming off of that area.
That's great. That's very promising results. What are some reasons that people would decide not to install a saturated buffer other than like cost probably?
So saturated buffers can only be installed on certain types of land. So the NRCS has a conservation practice standard, I believe it's 604, that tells you exactly what kind of landscapes these work best on. So very flat landscapes, since we're raising the water table within the buffer, you end up raising the water table in the field too, which is not exactly ideal for the farmer. So that might not be a great spot to put it on, as well as they have a certain height limitation for stream banks. Right now it's set at 8 feet. There's a group here at Iowa State looking into that part of the recommendation to see if 8 feet is actually the cutoff point or if we can go with larger banks. Just saying that anything above 8 feet, they considered when you saturate the banks, it might be a little less stable and you might increase stream bank erosion when you actually saturate the buffer. So it all depends on those sort of things and the land too. So if a farm field is kind of landlocked and there's really no good drainage system going through it, that means you really can't really put a buffer on there. So you're kind of out of luck for getting a saturated buffer put in there as well. So there are some limitations just based on landscape alone.
Yeah, and sometimes these riparian areas in dry years can be very productive for farmers. So there might be some hesitation to, pull this land out of production. But luckily, there is, some cost sharing that can go on with the Natural Resource Conservation Service as well as state entities to maybe cover some of that lost cost of removing the land from production. Because, while one year might be great, another year you might flood out and have a really poor crop in that same area. So there might be some hesitation there. And I'm very much of the thought that saturated buffers work great in certain parts of the landscape, but they aren't necessarily the silver bullet. There are a host of other conservation practices that are going to probably have to be implemented alongside saturated buffers in these spots that Tyler's talking about may not work. So in really flat landscapes, wood chip bioreactors are a practice that instead of using soil to enhance this denitrification, it's a pit full of wood chips, as well as natural wetlands kind of work in the same way. And so it's really going to take an integrated approach of all of these practices across the landscape where they kind of work best to remove enough nitrate to see a difference in water quality.
But I will just add this too. There are numerous farmers in the area, as well as Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois, Indiana, that are itching to get a saturated buffer put in. It does seem to be a very popular option, especially for farmers that already have a buffer installed. So all they have to do is basically put a control box and lay some more tile down. We get requests all the time to see if we have money to put them in. And then I know there are some other agencies, state and federal agencies, that are also getting requests for saturated buffers. So it does seem to be like a popular option, which is great. And we're kind of having a hard time keeping up with where they're all being placed and everything, because we kind of want to keep a tally rolling. So if any listeners know of a saturated buffer being put in, please let us know.
Yeah, we will for sure have some contact information for you guys in our show notes. So then, where is the future research for this headed? What else are you guys looking to study?
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about maybe the nitrous oxide part and then hand it over to Tyler to talk about maybe saturated buffer design and some of the really cool research he's doing now. I think the big caveat with our findings is that this was the first study looking at nitrous oxide emissions from saturated buffers, and it was done on 2 buffers in central Iowa. Both of these buffers were already, they'd been in perennial vegetation for close to 20 years. So with these new saturated buffers going into place that maybe were just previously in agricultural fields, there's a great need for future research on those types of buffers looking at nitrous oxide emissions. I don't think you can definitively, close the door on this question quite yet. I think we need to look at a wider range of conditions and years and types of saturated buffer designs to really hopefully we'll continue to find the results that we found in this study, but those studies do need to be done.
Yeah, and I'm like Morgan said, looking into more to newer saturated buffer designs. So the greatest limitation that our lab group sees to saturated buffers is the amount of water we can treat from each tile line. And some of these lines are huge. They're 12 plus inches in diameter wide, and they drain a lot of land. So if we can't capture a good percentage of that water, then we're only removing a very small percentage of the total nitrate load, the mass of nitrate coming out of the tile. So we want to try to increase the amount of water we can put into the buffers. So part of the conservation practice standard from the NRCS says one way of doing this is by putting a gravel envelope around the distribution pipe to kind of increase the wetting diameter within the soil, and then that would theoretically increase the amount of water we can put into the soil. Now, there's some debate about that. A lot of people think that it's still going to be limited by the soil texture and the hydraulic connectivity of the soil, but only one way of determining that, and that's to put one in. So that buffer we actually designed one and being put in as we speak, I think. We started it on Tuesday, got rained out yesterday, and now, we are currently working on putting the rest of it in, laying the pipe down the next couple of days. So that data should be interesting. And then another method is to put in double distribution pipes. So one by the field edge, one maybe halfway through the buffer, to see if we can wet more of the soil, saturate more of the soil that way. There was a modeling paper put out by our research group by Dr. Dan Janes and Dr. Thomas Eisenhart that said theoretically, yes, we can increase the amount of water we can put into a buffer, but that's a model. And as all the modelers out there know, some models are more correct than others, but none of them are completely 100% correct. So we have to test this in the field to see if that model is true, if that theory is true. So that's what I'm mostly working on, kind of increasing the amount of water we can treat with these systems.
How delightful. This sounds like really fun and rewarding research, and how fun to be on the cutting edge on this very show as it's being installed. That's really a lot of fun. Sorry you got rained out though. It's been a unfortunate weather week to be doing any kind of outdoor work here in the Midwest. I've got 3 questions left for you. The first would be, if people want to learn more about this subject, where can they go?
I would say starting out, if you're interested in any sort of tile drainage activity, including saturated buffers, bioreactors, constructed wetlands, tile in general, I would go to the transformingdrainage.org website, and they have a lot of great links with great visuals on what a saturated buffer looks like and a little cartoon animation. I believe there's also some great video links in there, most of them YouTube, so you can probably just YouTube saturated buffers. Another one is the Soil and Water Conservation Society has a great saturated buffer facts page. It's a very long link, so I think if we put it in the notes for this podcast, that'd be great. But also, if you just Google Soil and Water Conservation Society and saturated riparian buffers in the same search, it'll probably come up. And there's a lot of links to fact sheets, step-by-step pictures of a saturated buffer installation. So if you want to see a trencher actually putting tile in, that's there as well as a great video demonstrating how these buffers work. There's also, for anybody who's going to the international annual meeting of ASA, CSSA, and SSSA, there is a group. What is it called, Morgan?
It's Managing Denitrification in Agronomic Systems. And I know they have a oral session for San Antonio with not only saturated buffer work, but also bioreactors and constructed wetland and drainage management work as well.
Excellent. Our staff would be so happy to see anybody there. Any other resources you wanted to share?
If you have more interest in greenhouse gas emissions in general, the EPA's website has a nice distribution of different types of greenhouse gases that are emitted from agriculture and other sectors of the United States, as well as our Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They have some great resources as well if you are interested in learning more about greenhouse gas emissions.
Excellent. We will include links to all of those things and maybe some of the resources that were mentioned earlier in the show. I will definitely be looking up those trenchers because I am super intrigued. And then the second question is, if people want to get involved in these conservation practices or research, what can they do?
I would say first and foremost, you can always encourage your local congressman to support the Conservation Reserve Program in the Farm Bill. There is a lot of cost share involved with that for practices such as saturated riparian buffers. So if you want to see more of these buffers go in to potentially reduce greenhouse gas emissions from once cropped land and also remove some nitrate in the meantime, that'd be the first really awesome thing to do. There can never be too much money thrown at these practices. Kind of talked about this before. Regardless of what practice you're talking about, it's going to take a lot of buffers, a lot of bioreactors to mitigate the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico and local drinking water issues that are involved with nitrate. So that's always a great thing to do. And then anybody who's listening who works with land managers, knows a farmer, maybe you guys are farmers, you guys spread the word about saturated riparian buffers. They are still a new practice. The first one was installed in 2010, so it's only 9 years old, and I know the word is spreading fast, but if anybody doesn't know or is unaware of this practice and what it could potentially do, just spread the word. Tell your neighbors, tell your friends, and yeah, that'd be great too.
Excellent. Yeah, that's some great advice. We did a podcast on the Farm Bill if anyone wants to learn more about that piece of legislation. And then last question for you guys is, what is one fun fact that people would not know about you if all they had was your research?
Yeah, Tyler and I would like to give a joint fun fact. So I don't know if anybody caught it, but we actually did a master's program together and then also a PhD. We've now kind of split ways a little. We're not in the same office anymore, but we both have daughters that are getting ready to turn 1 year old, and we both run marathons. So we are teased that we are an academic power couple is kind of the joke. So we didn't give that title to ourselves either. So it's been put upon us. So
I would love if you had given it to yourselves, though. That would have been really delightful.
Yeah, we're not that clever, I don't think. So
based on this interview, you are both exceptionally clever. So congratulations on being science buddies for life and physically fit family men. Good job. Yeah, so that's all the questions I have for both of you. Thank you so much for being on the show. I have learned loads, obviously, and it has just been an absolute delight and treasure to get to talk with you both.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us on. It was a blast.
Awesome. Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. You'll find a link to today's paper and other resources for this episode in our show notes or on our website. If you have any questions, comments, or recommendations for show topics, please contact us at podcast@sciencesocieties.org or on Twitter @FieldLabEarth. If you'd like to hear more content like this, please subscribe, and don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or anywhere else you find your podcast if you like our show. This podcast is a joint production of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. Special thanks to Lobo Loco for the use of their song Spook Castle on the intro and outro of our show. Opinions and conclusions expressed by authors are their own and are not considered as those of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, Soil Science Society of America, its staff, its members, or its advertisers.